Thank you for that introduction, Catherine. Really appreciate that. And just want to thank Catherine as well as the Livingston Library for organizing this talk and these talks in general. I've found great value in them, and I'm hoping that those in attendance will find value as well. So greetings and welcome. It's an honor to see all your lovely faces here today. And it's really encouraging to see that there are so many curious minds interested in this subject of Freemasonry. So I believe some basic introductions are in order. My name is Milos Jeziorsky, and I'm currently Master of Compact Lodge number 402, which meets in this building just like many other lodges do. I'm also a musician and artist by trade. I make music, everything from composing music for films and other projects and producing pop music and hip-hop music, and as well as visual art, which often coincides with what I do creatively with the music. Now, those are my passions, but Masonry is also one of my passions. And I hope that with today's lecture, you'll see why and have some more insight into those kinds of things. So, with one little preface, we'll begin. I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not a scholar, and it would be even laughable to call me one. My field is creativity. But I hope to bring to you some insights that I've found incredibly useful in my journeys throughout this craft and in the 7 years I've been a part of it, and to share with you that passion that I have. So what is Freemasonry? We should begin with that, right? What is Freemasonry? Is it a cult? Is it a religion? Is it a fraternity? Is it a cabal of rich white men plotting to take over the world? Is it a waste of time? All important questions, all deserving their own answers and all with equal merit. And I'm not going to stand up here like an authority figure and give you yes or no's on any of them. I would much rather give you some tools that you can answer those questions yourselves and the knowledge to help you with that. Now, those are serious questions, right? Because it's a strange world we live in. Cults do exist. Conspiracies do exist. So you're right to be cautious when joining a group of any kind or when hearing about an event in history that perhaps changes the cultural narrative and moves things in some way. So you're right to be cautious. And I know that you're intelligent because you're here and you want to know more. So I'll just share with you what I know. I'm assuming some of you here are Masons, some are not. Both obviously are welcome. And I hope that in the process of this lecture, we'll provide you, both crowds, with useful things, useful knowledge. So I'm going to paint a picture, really, of what Freemasonry is. And it's not just going to be one facet. We'll try to make it like a three-course meal. We'll first start with what a lodge is, what it does, what happens inside of a lodge meeting. Then we'll move on to some historical elements of the seeds of where Freemasonry as we know it began. And then we'll move even further back in time to ancient cultures and traditions that have very similar functions and very similar rituals and a lot of neat, very fascinating echoes to what Freemasonry is. So we'll begin with what happens in a lodge. There are only three things you can expect to happen in a lodge. Either rituals, lectures, or the business of a lodge. So, rituals. There are three primary rituals in Masonry, the first, second, and third degree. And each of them is designed and intended to be a transformative experience for the person who's participating, otherwise known as a brother, which I'll often be using this term if you're not familiar with it. So they're transformative experiences. And then there are several secondary kind of rituals which aren't really meant to be as significant as those three primary ones, but they still serve their function and they're important to the structure of Freemasonry. So then we have lectures. Lectures very much like this one, where we discuss a variety of topics. Often It can be about philosophy, it can be about certain insights from religions. Most lodges will have lectures about the history of Freemasonry and diving into the depth of its symbolism and how that relates in spirituality and personal growth. A lot of lodges will have lectures like that. Like in my lodge, Compact Lodge number 402, we have a group of guys that are very into the esoteric side of things, the very far-flung spiritual reaches of the human experience. So occasionally we'll get into the occult, occasionally we'll get into psychology. Our first lecture of the year was about the Jungian archetypes and how they apply to a lot of what happens in Freemasonry. So it's pretty broad, depending on who the master of that particular lodge is and what kind of lectures and what kind of things they would want the brothers to expand in and grow in. It also depends, of course, on the brothers in that lodge and where they want to progress in. Then, of course, we have the business of the lodge. And the business of the lodge. This must be where the Freemasons plan what to do with the stock market and how to conspire to get more money the next day and such, right? It's sorry to disappoint you. It's not like that at all. It's kind of the most boring aspect of meetings most often. The business of the lodge, like any meeting organization that has to rent out rooms once a month, quite often is things like bills, quite often is things like a possible election of new members, so you have to do a voting process. And scheduling of events, of course. I mean, there's many things that Masons do throughout New York State and all over the world. Charity events, just social events where it is a familial quality that most lodges try to establish. So there'll be basic social events, barbecues, where everyone can bring their significant other and their children, and those kinds of elements going on. So with that in mind, we'll transition. We'll go back, actually, to this rituals idea, because that's one of the key elements of what happens in a lodge, and it's also often one of the most misunderstood, misquoted, misrepresented parts of Freemasonry. Let's talk rituals for a little bit as we move forward. So even to my experience, my 7 years in Masonry, when somebody tells me that they're part of a group that once a month meets and does rituals, I can't help but get these kinds of images in my mind. No matter what that group is, even if I'm unfamiliar with them, I either assume they're getting together to worship some kind of satanic or demonic beast, or they're possibly going to be starting a sexual orgy without any kind of reason, except maybe they want to. Anyway, both of these, the first one is a work of propaganda based on a deliberate misreading of historical documents. The second one is not a screenshot of what happens in a lodge. It's a very good, entertaining film by Stanley Kubrick. So why do we have this association with rituals? I have it, and I can't help it. I've been a Mason this many years, and yet it's still there. You could probably blame it on our very healthy digestion of what media provides us, right? What news, what films, what our very entertaining content that we digest provides us. Often rituals are represented as like either a demonic group or a serial killer that does some kind of ritual involved with his act. But that's not the full story. And that's really a horrible misrepresentation, because we as humans, ritual is really incredibly essential to us and to our development and to our culture, every world culture, even modern cultures. You might not think that modern culture has many rituals, but we do. There's the ritual of marriage, one of our most ancient rituals. And it's really clearly designed as a ritual. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. And oftentimes the middle point in most rituals is called the liminal stage, where whoever's participating is said to be in a point of liminality. And what this is where they aren't quite who they were, and they aren't quite who they'll become yet. So in a point of liminality, like, for example, in a marriage, There's two people involved, of course, and they're at the moment where they're saying their vows, they're at a crossing point, right? They're no longer who they were, and they're not yet who they're going to become, which is a unit, a kind of new entity. It's very much a ritual, and I think one of the sacred rituals that most of our civilizations are founded upon. There's the ritual of a funeral. This is often not thought of as a ritual because when it unfortunately happens, when one of our loved ones passes, and we're under this weight of grief and the horrible logistics of trying to figure this thing out, we're not thinking about what's the higher symbolic meaning of what all this is. We have to get through it. But when you look at it from face value and see what's going on, it's very much a ritual, right? I mean, even the fact that me saying this, if you have a loved one and they die, just put their body in a dumpster because blah, blah, blah. But even that, clenches my heart. That's an awful thing to even utter. And why is it an awful thing? Because we attach symbolic meaning to our lives, to the people in our lives, to even objects that are related to the people we loved, right? So it's only right that through their passing, we have to symbolize something. We have to go through a process that is a ritual and that carries a weight of symbolic meaning. And that kind of becomes a good definition for what a ritual is. It's like an extended physical choreography that carries a weight of symbolic meaning. Right? And if you apply that to what else in your life has this kind of thing, an extended choreography with a weight of symbolic meaning, 99% of the time, it's a ritual that's going on. We have the ritual of graduation, the basic ritual of a birthday every year, and all religions are built on the foundation of rituals, right? How can they not be? Every single one of them has rituals, but we shouldn't assume that rituals, that religion has a monopoly on rituals. It doesn't. As human beings, as our consciousness and as the way our brain is kind of organized, and as someone like Carl Jung presented in his writings, there's layers to us. And rituals could possibly tap into this layer of our mind deep in the unconscious, full of archetypes, full of our symbols that we use and that give us meaning in the world around us. And so don't write them off so quickly. And don't assume that only Satanists have a monopoly on rituals or religions do. We're surrounded by rituals, and there's some of the most significant moments in our lives. And also, of course, there's the issue of rites of passage, which are very much often structured like a ritual. A rite of passage such as giving birth. There's nothing quite like that is comparable in the world. And it's very much structured like a ritual. And that might be one of the reasons why we even respond to rituals. Something like death being a rite of passage, and even birth itself. Some may theorize, or early psychologists theorize, that birth leaves an imprint on our consciousness and on the structure of our brain, that it's a traumatic event, and it lasts with us. It leaves some kind of echo. Whether that's true or not, it's certainly structured like a rite of passage. So, with that in mind, let's go even further back. 30,000 years to one of the earliest known artifacts, existing artifacts of human culture, which are in the Chauvet Caves in France. And I love this topic. It really drives one to activate your imagination when you're exploring this. If you haven't heard about the Chauvet Caves yet, Chauvet in France, I really urge you to check it out. There's a great movie about it by Werner Herzog, Cave of Forgotten Dreams. So what do we find in the Chauvet Caves from 30,000 years ago, aside from actually really beautiful paintings of various animals, but no humans, curiously enough? in one of the vast chambers in the Chauvet Caves, we find a cave bear skull, carefully perched upon a large stone in the shape closely approximating a square. This cave bear skull has been in that position for 30,000 years since one of our very early human ancestors placed it there. What's surrounding this skull? Well, the researchers who found it and kept it exactly everything as they found, because they wanted to record everything as it was 30,000 years ago. Surrounding the skull are burnt ashes of some kind of possible offering. What can we make of this? The only possible explanation would be a form of ritual, right? I mean, it certainly speaks of one, and anyone who's a Mason would certainly recognize something similar to this in terms of the representation of an altar, like all lodge rooms have at its center, and most religions have at their center as well, or at a primary place. The idea of an altar. So the idea that even the symbol of an altar, which is in the shape approximating a cube, was significant to us 30,000 years ago is mind-boggling. What is that? If that's not formed in the bedrock of who we are in terms of our psychology and the way our brain works, like, what else could there be? You know, it's a foundational element, one could argue. Chauvet Cave. So that's one facet of Masonry, what happens in the lodge. Let's travel through time a little bit, well, a lot of bit from 30,000 years ago, and now see what we commonly understand as the seed from where modern Freemasonry evolved. And to figure that out, we're going to have to travel to a time at the beginning of the Gothic cathedral building that was happening in about 1100 in France. That's when it started. This idea started of this style, the Gothic style of cathedrals. And it was so beautiful and so new that it became the dominant style for about 500 years following. And if you can imagine, back in 1100s AD, I mean, people's lifespans were probably maybe 30, maximum 40 years, different times. This was medieval ages. And for this idea, this new style to stay with humans for 500 years, that's incredibly significant. So here are just some examples of other Gothic cathedrals. It was the Sens Cathedral that was credited as the first Gothic style. From there, it spread all across Europe, all the way to Italy and Spain. And still, there's cathedrals built today, even as recently as in Canada not long ago, in that style, because it has such a presence, has such an artistic quality to it as you enter one of them, that it's really a work of humanity. So what ended up happening with these? Well, this idea of these Gothic cathedrals, they were immense works, right? And they required a lot of manual labor. And that's where this profession of a stonemason developed. Somebody who works with carving and sculpting stones and sculptures that would be part of the cathedral, and of course those who would be the ones who would plan out the work of these incredible pieces. Wow. It's 1248 AD, also France, but a lot of them were across the entire world. So stonemasons developed. And if you think about it, I mean, this kind of starts to make sense, because there's an early idea with stonemasons where if you only live 30 or 40 years, once you're a stonemason and you're getting steady work and steady pay, you're probably just going to stay in that profession. I mean, why not? And because of the short lifespans, many people who were stonemasons, I mean everybody, would never actually see the completion of any of these works. They would work on it for their entire life. They would pass away, and then who would pick up their tools afterward? Their children, usually their sons. And so this early seed starts to be planted of this idea that people still commonly talk about in modern Freemasonry, which is this idea that you have to have a family member already in Freemasonry to become a Freemason, which is no longer true, and it hasn't been true for a while. But it's enough of a prevalent idea that even a week ago when I was talking to somebody and they had somehow the topic came up that I was a Freemason, they said, "Oh, so you have somebody in your family part of it?" I was like, no, not at all. I'm the first of my family to even be curious about it. And in fact, they probably kind of find me a little weird in my family, and they're kind of like hesitant to ask any questions. This is like hallowed, mysterious ground that they don't know what to say. But this idea clearly would have probably started with the Stonemasons, and makes sense that the children would pick up the tools of their father and continue the work for maybe a few more lifetimes until those cathedrals were completed. So in the process of that, we start to find in these historical documents, because these documents exist of people keeping track of these temples, of these cathedrals, we start to find this term coming about called Freemason. And it's still not completely agreed upon what this term meant. But one little detail before that. The Stonemasons were gathered into what were called lodges. And in the lodges, they would receive their payment, they would receive education, and it would just be a way of organizing them. So they knew who was what, who was supposed to be working on what the plan was for the day or for that month. And that term still exists today. So when Masons meet, we meet in a lodge. Our lodge meeting is once a month regularly, and some lodges more than that. So the term Freemason started to evolve from this idea, it's theorized, that most stonemasons were supposed to be in their mother lodge, their first lodge they were part of, which was under the guidance of one master, and they oversaw everything. So the stonemason had allegiance to that one master in that one lodge. Then it seems like progressively, maybe there were specialists, maybe there were certain stonemasons that were so good at what they did that they started to travel and they started to be in demand in other places. And so this term starts to evolve called Freemason. It's theorized that a Freemason was someone who wasn't just part of their one lodge. They were able to travel to other countries, other cities, and work on the cathedrals that were in that area and get paid good wages for that. And that's how we start to find that term, and we've evolved it and adopted it to what it is today. But it seems to have roots there. It's commonly agreed that seems to be a thing. But now we encounter a problem, and it's a serious problem. I'm not a stonemason. None of the brothers in my lodge are stonemasons. None of the lodges I've gone to have really anybody who's a stonemason. The best we have in our lodge is maybe a carpenter, but I'm sure I certainly wouldn't expect him to build a cathedral. And we see stonemasons in existence in society, right? I sometimes see a truck of a stonemason, and maybe on the side of it I see an emblem of a perfect cubic stone and the tools next to it. And I'm like, oh, I know those tools. I'm very familiar with those. But who knows if they're Freemason or not. So what's going on here? This is very strange and fascinating. Why are we adopting the terms of these ancient stonemasons? We're adopting their tools as well as a symbolic representation and use of them in a symbolic way. And yet we're not required to actually work with any physical stones. And we take it for granted that that's kind of strange. It would be maybe like, as an analogy, a horticulturist society, right? And people are obsessed with the proper way to grow their flowers and these specific exotic plants and make the most beautiful gardens that they can. 100 years pass, 200 years pass, new members come in, and they no longer actually grow anything. And you ask them, so you guys know about plants, right? And they're like, no, we don't grow. Oh, so what do you do? Why are you in a horticulturist society? And they would say, no, now we grow the garden inside of ourselves. and we cultivate the exotic plants and the flowers that we have in our minds and in our souls. And you'd be like, okay, that's kind of odd. Growing something. But that's where we are. And honestly, that's one of the beautiful mysteries of Freemasonry, is that there was some kind of point where there was a transition. There was a transition from something very literal to something figurative, something symbolic. And forget, all the conspiracy theories and all this stuff that, people have fun thinking about. I think within that mystery, there's something very profound. It tells us something about human culture. It tells us something about just psychology, that something can start as something literal and valuable in culture, and then progressively become something symbolic, and yet still retain a lot of its value, and over time now be useful to the needs of the generations ahead of it. It's very unique to Masonry. Again, there's not many other examples of something going from literal to figurative like that. I mean, of course, it happens in religion, right? I mean, crucifixion, very horrible, literal execution, throughout time, it's become a symbol, and it's revered, and, the actual character of what it is no longer applies. So religions do it, but it's hard to find in other elements of society. And that's where these terms we see are actually also in the historical documents coming up, and that's operative and speculative. Operative Mason is one who actually works with stone. Speculative Mason is one who doesn't, who works with ideas, who works with the possible theology and the spiritual symbolism of the tools. And these terms start to come up throughout time as we're looking at Masonic documents. And it's also part of one of those beautiful mysteries of the craft. So that's an element of Masonic history. I think it places us in a relatively okay spot in understanding the original seed of it. We're going to move on to another element, but are there any questions, concerns so far? So now let's travel to a different point in time where hopefully we can see echoes of what we've described as Freemasonry in other traditions, non-building ones, but in ancient traditions called mystery schools. And we'll start with one of my favorites, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which took place in ancient Greece. Now, if you haven't ever heard of or read about the Eleusinian Mysteries, check it out. There's a lot of wonderful writing and historical information about this. And it'll just get your imagination rolling with all kinds of ideas and imagery. So the Eleusinian Mysteries, we know, are dated to at least have officially begun somewhere around 1600 BC, and they lasted for 2,000 years. That's a long time for anything to keep going. I mean, that's clearly longer than modern Freemasonry and many traditions. So Eleusis is an actual town in northwest Athens where the Eleusinian Mysteries would take place. And this became like the place to be, like the Eleusinian Mysteries. It was a event, a tradition that took place twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, every year, for 2,000 years. So anybody who was anybody wanted to attend this thing, and we know this through historical documents, we know this through the writers of the time who attended it and who spoke about somebody else who attended it. So it was very popular. And if you probably wanted to be cool and know what everybody else was talking about, you'd go to this thing. So people would travel vast distances, and we know that in the springtime were the lesser mysteries, and in the fall were the greater mysteries. The lesser mysteries were clearly some kind of element of a harvest festival, and this harvest festival was linked with the myth of Demeter in Greek mythology. The fascinating thing about the myth of Demeter, I really recommend, if you want to know more about this, to read the Hymn to Demeter, which is a very ancient document that is considered Proto-Greek. So existing even before any of the Greek states were established and many of the other myths were written down. So the myth of Demeter has to do with harvest, actually. There's an element to that. And the goddess Demeter is the goddess of the harvest. So the lesser mysteries seem to match up, and they make sense as part of a harvest festival, that there were elements of purification, that there were elements of offerings for a good year of harvest as it was beginning at that time. And interestingly enough, the lesser mysteries, you had to come and enjoy and participate in the lesser mysteries to be even considered for the greater mysteries. It was a prerequisite. The element of this myth that's described in the hymn to Demeter that you should check out if you want to know more. For those who aren't aware of this beautiful myth, Demeter, who was the goddess of the harvest, had a daughter, Persephone. Persephone was at one point kidnapped by the god of the underworld, Hades. She was brought down by force. When Demeter found out about this, she was so enraged and so bereaved at this betrayal by another god that she vowed to not let anything grow in the town of Eleusis, where she currently was, to let everybody die, everyone's going to have to suffer a famine, and that she would no longer just speak to any of the gods, have no more discourse with them, until her daughter was brought back. And this coincides possibly with a historical event that may have happened in Eleusis, which makes sense why they maybe started this tradition, where perhaps there was a famine at a time of their crops. And this became a way to guarantee offerings that things would continue as they should be, and that Demeter would be pleased. So the greater mysteries, which happened during the fall in September, so many amazing details about these. So all the major writers of the time are known to have participated and gone to these. The thinkers, the intellectuals, the farmers, the basic workers, you name it. Who was allowed in? Men, women, children, slaves. Anybody could participate. It was not exclusive. But you had to have participated and already joined the lesser mysteries and been a part of that. So that's a fascinating distinction. Man, woman, slave, child. That's kind of rare, and everyone was equal in a sense. Now, what's kind of this strange idea is that despite how many of these people, different kinds of people and stations in society participated, we don't really know exactly what occurred during the ritual of the greater mysteries. It's still a mystery to us. And in a sense, that's pretty amazing. How many people participated and all were sworn to secrecy? How is that possible? The second you learn about something or someone learns about something today, it goes right up on their page online, or they take a selfie with it, or what have you. I mean, that's just human nature in a sense, right? Expressing itself through our current mediums. But even back then, you would assume someone would have written something down in their journal and be like, oh man, that was juicy stuff. But as influential and as profound as these experiences we know were, no writing exactly is found that tells everything that happened. But why? Because all that were sworn to secrecy, those who betrayed that vow, were punished by death, by first a trial and an actual literal execution. So that's kind of severe. So you kind of, you took your vow pretty seriously. It's not a symbolic death. You'd actually be murdered. And we know that these trials occurred. So what do we know about the ritual, though? We do have elements, little pieces that we piece together from different writers of the time, and it's fascinating. So we know that the initiates had to first fast, and then they were led into what was known as the Cave of Hades, which still exists in Eleusis, which you can go and visit. And so in this cave is where most of the ritual then took place. There was a procession into the cave. And again, we find a fun little fascinating echo. We see another cave, right? We see, as our ancient humans 30,000 years ago seemed to practice rituals in caves. And as you observe this room, which was originally a lodge room, when the lights are lowered, the doors are closed, this is very much a cave, isn't it, as well, where Masons practice. So a fascinating echo going on there. There's a significance with caves throughout human civilization. And it brings to mind this fascinating phrase I've heard that really fits with quite a lot of this stuff, which is that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I love it. So once you were in the cave and you were in this procession, what else happened? You were asked to disrobe, to go completely naked. You were given an animal skin to wear. And this is a fascinating detail as well, because many cultures treat the idea of an animal skin, especially one from a virgin animal, as a symbol of purity, and often purity of the soul and purity of the experience one was about to have. You're given this animal skin, and then you are given something to drink. And this is the point where a lot of historians agree, obviously, there was something drank and something was seen. What was drank is just fodder for all kinds of fun speculation. Because whatever was drank and whatever was seen afterward was profound enough to, one, keep people silent, and two, speak of it as if it was one of the most important experiences of their lives. We can assume it had something to do with that myth of Demeter, though, because that hymn to Demeter was, in a sense, like a sacred document to Eleusis. And it was very much something that came out of their culture. So there's an element in that hymn, in that myth, where Persephone, she is kidnapped and brought to the underworld, perhaps symbolic of the cave, right? Perhaps the cave is symbolic of this. That's why it was the cave of Hades. And before she can be let out, which she eventually was, Demeter puts the place to famine, gets the gods' attention, and the gods are like, okay, we got to figure this out. These people are no longer making any proper offerings. They're all going to die. Demeter is PO'd, and we got to figure something out. So they started, after they spoke with her, they came to a little bit of an agreement. They sent Hermes down to speak with Hades and come to an agreement and let him know what was going on. Hades, of course, was displeased, but he relented. He said, okay, I'll let her go. But he had one final trick up his sleeve. The trick was, before Persephone was about to be released, he gave her something to eat. And it's perhaps that she didn't know about this rule of Hades, and it's perhaps that she was being careless. But the rule in Hades was, if you ate anything from the ground of Hades, you were cursed to forever spend your eternity in Hades. He gave her this pomegranate. She ate only of 6 seeds of the pomegranate. The deal became, after she left, that she must spend 6 months out of every year in Hades, in the underworld with Hades. And that starts to coincide symbolically with what happens in Eleusis throughout the year, of the crops no longer growing properly, and then harvest season beginning. And that was part of their explanation for the symbolism going on in this myth as well. It's a very powerful symbolism, and now it starts to make sense. What this procession, what this experience they're doing is reenacting. It's reenacting the journey of Persephone into the underworld. And it's really an experience of death and rebirth, right? It must be. There's no other way it can be so profound. And whatever these people were drinking, we know that hallucinogens quite often give somebody this exaggerated experience or profound spiritual experience of death and rebirth. And things like ayahuasca, often I've met people who tell me about their experience on it, and just from that one time is enough to change like the rest of the course of their lives. So it's a fascinating thing to consider. And another fascinating element, there's so many things in this, is about that in the hymn to Demeter, it is mentioned that Demeter at the time refuses any red wine from one of these servants that speaks to her and tries to figure out what's going on. But she does ask instead for a very specific concoction. to drink. And the theory is that this concoction she asks for, which in Greek is called a kykion, it hides the secret to what it is everybody drank. And the concoction is very strange. It's barley and water with delicate pennyroyal. Barley and water with delicate pennyroyal. Those were her exact words. What else that could mean, or maybe in the original Greek, if that's mistranslated or if there's some secret going on in there, many writers have theorized. So it's a fun thing to check out if you're curious about that element of it. Now, a curious element also, as it relates to Masonry, is this idea of the pomegranates keeping Persephone in the underworld. Whenever you're in one of these lodges, and you look at the pillars, there's occasionally pomegranates decorating them. Whether that's an echo of this in some way, shape, or form, or just the fact that various fruits and objects throughout time have had various symbolism is up to you to decide, but I think it's a fascinating echo. Now, the Eleusinian Mysteries were so well known at their time that even word of them spread all the way to Russia and Egypt. There's evidence of people writing about them, of people knowing somebody who attended. So it was very significant for its time. Here is a quote from a writer who can only be describing what he must have experienced inside of the greater mysteries. And he says, "I approached to the confines of death, and having trod on the threshold of Persephone, I returned from it, being carried by all the elements. At midnight I saw the sun shining with a splendid light, and I manifestly drew near to the gods beneath and the gods above, and proximately adored them." Oh man, if that's not like a hallucinogenic experience, I don't know what is. But that's profound. I mean, granted, people can have incredibly spiritual experiences and visions without anything in being ingested, but for the fact that so many people who did participate had similar experiences, perhaps speaks to something else going on. Another little quote from philosopher Cicero, speaking of the mysteries, he says, "The mysteries not only taught men how to live, but how to die." And then, in 392 AD, the wise Theodosius put on a decree which said, all non-Christian faiths must be destroyed. All pagan beliefs and systems and temples must be burned and destroyed. And with that, in 392 AD, we saw the end of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Untimely and unfortunate end to something that was clearly an important and valuable element of the culture. Even Plato attended it. Many, many writers of the time and thinkers. Moving on. That brings us to another fascinating mystery school that we can see some echoes of Freemasonry in, the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans, of course, started from the man himself, Pythagoras, and this was a man of a staggering intellect. He was way ahead of his time, and clearly it makes sense why starting his own school almost led to kind of a cult forming around him. But the fascinating thing about him and his integrity of character, he didn't want to be a sage, he didn't want to be a religious leader. He specifically wanted to be a philosopher. And fascinatingly enough, we can thank him for even that term philosopher. It didn't exist before him. He invented this term. And the difference was, his distinction was, before him there were many sages. There were people who said they claimed to know the true knowledge, and they were presenting themselves as religious sages. And the distinction is a sage is one who knows, and a philosopher is one who is on the path to knowing, who's always struggling to know. So we see this starting with Pythagoras. He was a philosopher and a mathematician, incredibly influential in his era. The myth of him, the story about him says that when he was born, as he became a teenager and started thinking for himself, and he absorbed all the education that Greece had to offer, all the philosophy, and when that was exhausted, he was also initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries. And when that was exhausted and he understood that, he traveled far and wide outside of Greece. He went as far as Egypt and was initiated into the mysteries of Isis. He traveled to Syria and was initiated in the mysteries of Adonis of their time, to Babylon, to that day, which was called Hindustan, which is modern-day India. And it's said that he was initiated into the Brahmins of Elephanta. After some difficulties, he finally had convinced them, and apparently his name is still preserved in their records. What we can assume was possibly someone like him. In those records of the Brahmins of Elephanta is the name, the Ionian teacher, which is said to be Yavankarya. And he was from a place of Greece which you would call him Ionian. There he is, dressed to the nines. So, once he returned from all these studies, he founded a school. Again, he didn't want to found a cult. He didn't care about that. He wanted to progress humans in some way, shape, or form and explore these thoughts and these ideas, and specifically mathematics. He became obsessed with numbers. So much so that one of his first insights was this idea that you can measure music. And he did. In his writings, you can see him figuring out the specific mathematical ratios from which a string produces certain notes. One very, very simple example that's been known forever, but just as an example for those who maybe aren't experienced in music, when you take a string and you place your finger in the exact middle, so the exact length of the left and the right side are proportional, it produces the same note that it started with when it was an open string, but it's called one octave higher. So it produces a note that is equivalent but doubled in frequency. So things like this. He figured out all these different ratios, more very complex measurements, which is fascinating that people before him were just playing music naturally and not really charting it in this way. But that just speaks more for how we are as humans, that we can develop art forms without really, analyzing them, just intuitively and through the unconscious insights that we have about the back and forth we're having with that instrument or that art form. So those are one of his first insights, the measurements of music. And then, because of that, he started to assume, like, well, what if we extrapolate? If all of music is mathematics, and we can measure the whole exterior world, then everything is music. Everything is measurement, everything is numbers, everything is proportions and ratios, and we're all related to each other through different depths of ratios and harmonies and disharmonies. That's a profound idea to see this way. It's where this term music of the spheres comes about, this idea that the planets are in very specific ratios and proportions to each other as well, right? So some of the fascinating beliefs of Pythagoras and his school, they believed all living beings had souls, animals included, that the soul was an immortal aspect. And because of this, you start to encounter a problem. Well, if everything has a soul and everything should be respected, what do we do with eating? That's not good. So, all people who wanted to become Pythagoreans in his school became vegetarians, as he was. And this was such a prominent element of the Pythagoreans that for centuries later, all the way up until the Victorian era, if you were a vegetarian, you were said to be in the Pythagorean diet. Like, that's how significant of an idea that was and how early and progressive of an idea he had presented there, which for that time probably wasn't easy either. And here's one of his beautiful quotes. "As long as man continues to be the ruthless destroyer of lower living beings, he will never know health or peace, For as long as men massacre animals, they will kill each other. Indeed, he who sows the seed of murder and pain cannot reap joy and love. Deep stuff. Definitely applies today. I'm not a vegetarian, so I'm not like on the pulpit here preaching for everybody. But it does make me want to be a better person. So what do we know of the rituals in the Pythagorean school? Well, this is really fascinating stuff. So for one, you had to first be a candidate. And their ritual, their first element of a ritual was more like it was proving your character and seeing if you're up to snuff to be one of these almost like monks that you became, which also, I think I mentioned, were men or women were allowed into the Pythagorean school. So one of these rites of passage was you had to survive a night alone in a cave. We see a cave again. And the night alone in a cave without any light, any food, any water, which was apparently supposed to be haunted by the ghosts of the candidates who didn't make it. Then there was another rite of passage. After that, if you completed that without going crazy, you were locked up in a cell for 1 week with only a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread and paper to draw and meditate upon the symbols of the Pythagoreans, which were various elements of this, what's called a tetractys. And each of those dots first appears as a singular dot, and then you add another dot, and it changes the shape, and it changes the meaning, and it's really mind-boggling and fascinating. It's very, very esoteric stuff. If you like esoteric stuff, that's what that's all about. So look up the Pythagoreans, and specifically this triangle called a tetractys, T-E-T-R-A-C-T-Y-S. Not an easy one. So after you succeeded in surviving those 2 trials, maybe they could be called, you were accepted into 3 degrees, also very similar to Freemasonry. There were the degrees of novice, disciple, and adept. And in the procession of novice to disciple, you were initiated into the Pythagorean sacred word. Fascinating idea there. And we don't know what that sacred word was. And also the Pythagorean science of numbers was then revealed to you. Their value system clearly was one, principles of respect, tolerance, a union and tolerance of religions, and clearly they were organized in a system of lectures and discussions. So it wasn't like there was a dogma and everybody had to believe Pythagoras. Everyone could have their own ideas and they could discuss it and they could figure things out together. Another fascinating thing that tells you about their morals and their value system, marriage was considered sacred. Wives were considered equals, which for that time was rare. And suffering was considered the anvil on which the human soul is forged. And they believed, although it was to be endured bravely, it is never to be deliberately caused. And finally, anyone who betrayed the secrets of the Pythagoreans weren't killed like in the Eleusinian Mysteries, but a symbolic death occurred, wherein they erected a tomb for that person, symbolic of that now their soul was dead, and their name was inscribed upon it. So in closing, we've looked at 3 different facets. We've looked at the lodge and its doings. We've examined rituals. We've seen maybe perhaps the original seed that is commonly agreed to be where Freemasonry evolved, and then ancient mystery schools and how they relate to some of the practices of today. So there's some logistical details we can mention that is fascinating. In the state of New York, there are 800 official lodges. It's a lot. It may be more since I've originally read that estimate. They're grouped into 51 districts. And this idea is how to keep track of all these lodges. You put them in districts, and the districts, section off certain parts of every city and town. And then, of course, there's the Grand Lodge of the state of New York. And so then, of course, if you think out the logic of it, well, how do you guarantee that one lodge is not messing about and kind of creating new elements of the rituals and kind of saying like, well, in the first degree ritual, it would be really fun if there was a pink elephant that kind of just waltzed in and like really freaked them out, you know? So what do you do? Like, that's what part of what the Grand Lodge does in each state. In the state of New York, we have the Grand Lodge meets in this building. And so the main job of the Grand Lodge is to send out its representatives, one for each district. And in that district, that representative is called the district deputy. They visit each lodge and they make sure that everybody is doing stuff the right way, is doing stuff by the book. Lodges that aren't doing stuff by the book, by the way it's been done for centuries, they are put on trial, and unless they change, they then become clandestine lodges. And those lodges do exist as well. So be careful if you're not a Mason and you're curious about joining. Make sure that the lodge you're interested in is not a clandestine lodge, because then you won't really be officially a Mason internationally. You'll only be part of that one lodge, and that would be kind of sad. There's still little avenues that you can do after that, but that's what the Grand Lodge does. So the way I see it in closing is that Freemasonry and any of these kinds of traditions, they spring up as a natural element of our psychology. It's not like one tradition has a stake for what human endeavor and spirituality really is, right? Just like there are multiple religions. These traditions keep springing up throughout time because it's a call from the human spirit. It's a call to understand, it's a call to connect with individuals. And whether Freemasonry would have ended perhaps in the 1100s or not, something else I believe would have taken its place that was very similar and would have still continued to today. And that's where we are. And I'll close on that.